Today we're going to be looking at some of the iconic objects relating to 20th century ballet. Right, so it's a large box, but eventually we get glimpses of Margot Fonteyn's tutu that she wore in The Sleeping Beauty. So this costume, made to the 1946 design by Oliver Messel, was worn by Fonteyn actually in the 1960s. But it was a role that was very, very important to her, and indeed to the company that became the Royal Ballet. We have such a large box because we want to keep the circular tutu as flat as possible. Tutus are fiendishly difficult to look after in long terms. So we have to have these boxes specially made for tutus and to keep them in pristine condition. Now it's out of the box, you get more of a sense of the size of the skirt. I think that this is actually fascinating as a costume. It's a costume that was remade at the end of the run of The Sleeping Beauty for the Royal Ballet, and this is always known as the Messel Sleeping Beauty. It's unusual that the designer should be the defining name for a production. But Oliver Messel, who was, I think, a major British designer, worked on this, and it opened the Royal Opera House after the Second World War. Messel used such rich colours. Now, when you start looking at the pink here, you think, oh, it's not that rich. But underneath, you're going to have all the different layering, that when the dancer is moving, you're going to have that sort of flash of colour the whole time. So it really is quite bright there. And that sense of actually slightly different colours coming in. It's not just all one colour. I think of something that's actually very important, particularly in tutus, which are short, so you'll see in the underside as well as the top of the costume. So this is a costume that was actually worn in what is known as Act 1 of The Sleeping Beauty, which is her 16th birthday party. It's the point at which she would be pricked and fall asleep. And this costume is worn for a section that's known as the Rose Adagio. So there's this wonderful dance in which she is actually presented with a series of roses by 4 prospective cavaliers, which is why it is usually a pink or red colour. When the ballet went on first in St. Petersburg, it was actually a much darker red. The ballet was first seen in London in 1921 with the Argelev's company, and at that point it was still a much richer red. But Messel really starts the pink tradition. Aurora is the young girl, and it's the idea of dawn. Aurora means dawn. So traditionally, that is the name for the Sleeping Beauty, the princess. This is what's known now as an English tutu. It's fairly old-fashioned in terms of making. It's basically, you've got your bodice, which comes in several panels, and that is attached to another section here for the hips, which is referred to as the basque. It then comes down into a V, which is, of course, very flattering to the figure. So I think very important here, we have the darker ribbons on the shoulder. And then he's attached onto those just one little bead. And the whole sleeve, which is actually unusual to have on a tutu, a sleeve, and I think it was to give a sense of this is a young girl being portrayed. They are attached sort of loosely with elastics so that the dancer is free to move. It's always one of the challenges is how do you cut a costume for movement? Messel was somebody who could actually do wonderful decoration, often on the cheap. He had imagination. We are in a period when people were going for the newly invented nylons and things like that. And onto that, you place your decoration. And in this case, it's largely appliqued. You've got wonderful braid that's been worked out, adding various sequins that are going to pick up the light. Those sort of elements are very important on stage. And then this wonderful sort of almost sort of Baroque style of decoration, in fact, is a silver sort of lame type of fabric cut up, and then the edges are all trimmed with another braid. So there's a lot of work that goes into the decoration. One of the things I love about this costume is that some of the decoration It's very typical for Messel. It's sort of found what he could find to use. This sort of laced part at the top, in fact, is an industrial material. But in the 1960s, when this costume was made, a lot of costumiers were being very inventive in terms of what they found to use. Some of these things have survived happily. Some of them, unfortunately, are not materials with longevity. But this, of course, does have that. But it works from a distance. That's one of the fun things about theatre costumes, is the fact that you can use all sorts of strange materials and yet it will look very impressive to the audience. One of the things with this costume is that you can see it's made in a lot of different panels to fit the body well. Nowadays, you would quite often put in a panel that was a stretch fabric. Typically, of course, it fastens with hooks and eyes, which is still the way that you will fasten a dance costume, much safer than putting a zip in. It might pull apart. If we just sort of look at the inside of a costume, it's always sort of fascinating. There's usually a sense of it's be lined with cotton to help with sweat. And also, you're going to have the label that sort of tells you it was made at the Royal Opera. It gives you your production, so Sleeping Beauty. It also will give you the scene, Act 1, and for whom it was made. It actually says as character Rose Adagio rather than Aurora, and obviously identifies it as Margot Fonteyn's costume. If we look underneath, I think it's always fascinating to see the underside of a tutu. So the different layers all cut to different lengths and then stitched together, and within them you will find that there is also a hoop, and that helps to keep the shape. It is a real star costume, I think, very important. We're lucky we do have several costumes that were worn by Margot Fonteyn, who was such a great ballerina and so important for the development of ballet in Britain. So, in fact, Margot Fonteyn wasn't the real name of the ballerina, as was so often the case. Her real name was Peggy Hookham, but Ninette de Valois, who ran the company, was always determined that her dancers would have sort of properly sort of sounding starish names. Margot Fonteyn became the prima ballerina absoluta of the Royal Ballet. She had a real sense of style, and she could do the choreography effectively and artistically. She takes a pose, she goes into arabesque, she goes into attitude, she takes a flower, and she holds that pose. And it is said that Fonteyn is really the one who developed holding the poses in a most impressive way. So this is also a tutu from the same production. It's for Act 2 rather than Act 1. And in Act 2, Aurora is a vision that appears to the prince and that will then lure the prince to the castle to kiss her and wake her up after 100 years. The scene actually is all quite watery, so it gives that sort of sense of sort of a flow, but it's that sort of atmosphere that is being evoked in the decoration. So although there are sort of what look like little feathers on it, they're not sort of really feathery feathers. I think they're wonderful little bits of plastic, really. We're not looking at a bird here by any means. We are looking at an idealised version of a young princess who the prince will fall in love with. Now, this costume was actually made for another ballerina called Nadia, Nerina, who was South African by birth and was one of the dancers who came to Britain in that period after the Second World War. I think she found Aurora quite a challenging role. It is a challenging role, there's no doubt about it. She was somebody who actually wrote about how it was one of the ballets in which she sometimes felt that she was sort of completely there with the audience, and so she did enjoy dancing it. Because it's a vision, it's a light-coloured costume. And indeed, Oliver Messel was very good at creating misty rural scenes, basically. And so I think this is one that he really enjoyed. With this tutu, it's very much more simple with the straps. They are basically elastic straps onto which they have stitched a trim. In fact, I think it's very much the same sort of fabric as was used on Aurora's tutu. It gives the illusion of lace, and it's actually got a gold thread that goes through it. This is what's known as now as an English tutu. The basque area is all decorated. It's probably wire with a cotton thread wound round it. Very sort of typical of the material that Messel liked to use. And so once again, we've got the V shape of the centre, which is so flattering to the dancer's body. In the middle 20th century, dancers were still probably a little bit more shapely than they are now. And so this was a way of actually flattering the physique. Now the main part of the tutu will go straight down and you won't have that extra detail by and large. The Sleeping Beauty was one of Oliver Messel's really great triumphs. We are lucky at the V&A to have such a rich collection of his designs and a number of costumes to go with them. It's also fascinating to see how costumes develop over time. And that's one of the things that's really nice with something like The Sleeping Beauty. It goes on, first of all, in 1946 at Covent Garden. It continues through to the end of the 60s with successful long-running theatre. It's not just a static, here is the costume. It is a version of the costume. So this costume, actually, we have unboxed and put onto a mannequin so you can actually get to see it. It's a costume from the ballet Cotillon, which was choreographed by George Balanchine in 1932. Now, this sort of costume really is based on what we think of as a romantic tutu. Romantic tutus really developed 100 years earlier than this ballet. So think of a Victorian dress. Think of it in a very light, flowing fabric, so chiffons and silks, and then think of it slightly shorter so that a dancer can move and show off their feet. And that becomes really the basic pattern for a ballet costume for a woman. Cotillon, it's an abstract ballet in many ways. It's young people at a party, and this costume actually is called the Hand of Fate. So basically the dancer comes into the party, performs, in a way casts a change of mood. It's been light-hearted up until that point, and the costume is a contrast with the others. It's the same basic shape, same very simple idea, a velvet bodice and a net skirt, but the other women were all in coloured costumes, and they actually all had white gloves, whereas the Hand of Fate had black gloves. So she instantly stood out as something different. And it's really enlivened by having the stars both on the bodice and the skirt, and then we also have a couple of moons as well, so this sort of sense of night coming in. It's designed by Christian Bérard, I think a very important French designer. The original version was made by Korinska. Korinska is one of the most important costumiers of the 20th century. She was somebody who had fled from Russia after the revolution, established herself in Paris in various ateliers, and a number of designers discovered her talent and insisted that their costumes were made by her. She was somebody who I think had a great sense of colour, and you'll never get a costume that is one colour. So even with this, you look at it, it's black and gold with the decoration, but in actual fact, if you look underneath in the skirts, it's a light blue. And so that would have sort of come through as the dancers whirled around a space. And so I think it's fascinating that looking at the way Oliver Messel had given the colour to the underskirts of Fonteyn's tutu in particular, I suspect that he had partly picked it up from what Korinska was doing. It may not be something very deliberate, but you can see how the trends set in, and certainly that use of colour in costumes like this, and particularly in this production, very clearly shows you what colour can do. When people talk about tutus, they almost always also talk about toe shoes or point shoes, which the ballerinas would wear with those costumes. And so I'm going to show you a couple of shoes, and they are actually presented rather differently. So opening this box, you can see how beautifully packed items can be. And this is because this shoe has actually been out on tour, and so it's got to be well and securely packed for travel. This shoe actually was given to Cyril Beaumont, who was a great fan of the Ballet Russe, by one of the ballerinas, really the main ballerina, I think, of Diaghilev's company, Tamara Karsavina. And the shoe itself, to actually preserve it, has also been put with a frame inside to keep it in shape. And this is a particularly interesting one. It's been signed by Karsavina to Cyril Beaumont. And so inside it says, Monsieur Cyril Beaumont, Tamara Karsavina, so that's the ballerina, and then July 1914, but it's all written in French, of course, and then it says Les Papillons. So this shoe she would have worn in the ballet Papillon. Cyril Beaumont would probably have met her afterwards and asked for a shoe, and traditionally dancers would give one shoe, not a pair of shoes, and they would sign. So this is actually the point when Karsavina was really, I think, absolutely at her peak as a ballerina. The shoe, the dancers will actually mark them so that they don't slip. This one has not been in any way actually darned to help the performance, and the ribbons, you can actually see where they were, but they have been removed. So this is very much, I would say, what I would think of as a presentation ballet shoe, probably worn once and then passed on to an admirer. Here is another ballet shoe, and this is very much more how most of our shoes will actually be preserved. In this case, we have a shoe with its ribbon attached. In this instance, the ribbon has been supported with some extra tape behind it. Traditionally, dancers will actually sew on their own ribbons. Sometimes dancers will add extra areas of elastic, anything to keep your toe shoe comfortably in position. Here we have the ribbons, and you can see the extra support that has been just tacked on there to keep it. So this is not a shoe that has been given in a special presentation mode, but it is a shoe that was acquired by Cyril Beaumont, and we think it is quite likely that it was one of Anna Pavlova's shoes. Now, Anna Pavlova was probably the greatest ballerina of the 20th century. She was somebody who was determined to take ballet to all corners of the earth. Pavlova always favoured Nicolini ballet shoes. Nicolini is an Italian company, and these shoes are, as we will see on the back, does just have the Nicolini branding. So that is almost certainly the case. And we do have actually some other shoes that we also think, but she didn't sign any of the shoes, unfortunately, so we don't have that concrete evidence. Anna Pavlova, when she was touring, had lots of shoes. And there's this wonderful photograph taken in a Paris dressing room where you see the shoes laid out around her. What is fascinating when you look at it closely is you can see that there are the shoes that have already got the toe darned. So obviously those were ones that were being worn in performance. And then there are other shoes that are laid out that are obviously in pristine condition. But I think it is so important to be aware that a ballerina can get through more than one pair of shoes in one performance. As you can see with this shoe, it is darned at the toe. And traditionally, that's what dancers would do, ballerinas would do it. So again, it gave them more grip on the stage. It's fascinating because actually a ballet shoe, the point, which some people assume is going to be wood because it is so solid, is actually made up of layers of glue and hessian and card, and that makes the firm point of the shoe. Now, when a ballerina gets their shoes, they frequently then hammer the toes or put them in the doorway and close the door on them to soften them. Point shoes really developed through the 19th century alongside the tutus. As the tutus got shorter, the point shoes got harder. Dancers want to balance for longer, and so the stiffer point helps them. Although initially dancers such as Maritaglioni, who are in the first generation of going on pointe. They had shoes that were completely soft. They might darn the toe, as was done early in the 20th century. They may possibly have added in some card or something of their own volition, but we don't know that for sure. But they would only be on pointe very briefly. Gradually, the dancers wanted to stay on pointe longer, and we get to the point with the Rosadagio, which is all about balance, which is really showing off the development of that style of thing. That is also important because they're doing a lot more turns. Now, if you're doing those sort of turns, you don't want a lot of fabric around your legs. And so the tutus really get shorter to enable the dancers to move freely. And as I say, the pointe shoes develop alongside that to help them perform those steps. This pair of shoes definitely has been worn, not necessarily worn an enormous amount, but I think one can see the toe is grubby, and I think with the ribbons on it, it does suggest that there has been wear in this shoe. It's fascinating to know that within the V&A we have so many treasures relating to ballet, and it's been wonderful to be able to share these items with you today.